Sri Lanka is defaulting on its debt in just the latest sign of the nation's escalating economic collapse. The government had failed to pay back almost $80 million in interest for bonds sold to foreign investors. The grace period for those IOUs ends on Wednesday. And it's not just creditors that are losing out. Sri Lanka's energy ministry says the country can no longer afford to pay for petrol shipments due to the rising cost of crude in international markets. That's led to widespread shortages, fueling anger over the government's management of state coffers.
We don't know what will happen next moment, but I feel very sad. So please, I'm asking from the government again to have the peace, the happiness to people, within the month, the people.
Enough is enough. In my grandfather's time, my mother's time, lots of problems have faced, and I think the future has to change. The future of Sri Lanka has to change immediately.
For more on the story, let's go to Chayu Damasinghe. He's the head of macroeconomic research at the think tank Frontier Research. He joins us from the Sri Lankan capital, Colombo. Welcome back to the program, Chayu. Now, I guess the simplest question to ask is, how did Sri Lanka get here?
Well, Sri Lanka has been having this underlying problem. You've had a budget deficit problem, a current account deficit problem, which also led to a debt problem. The first two problems for decades, the last debt problem for the last 20 years or so. But this really got exacerbated since the new government came in 2019, where they took policies that worsened these underlying problems. We took severe tax cuts, which massively increased our budget deficit to some of the worst in the world. We printed money as a result of the pandemic and all, but we continued printing money beyond that as well, which led to a lot more imports and consumption, which led to our current account deficit worsening. And that locked us out of international capital markets as we got downgraded with those policy measures that were mistakes. And that meant that in order to pay our debt that we did have over the last 2 years, we kept drawing down our reserves. The reserves themselves over the last 10, 15 years had been mostly driven up by debt itself. So now that we're locked out of capital markets, we've drawn down our reserves down to what is essentially zero by now. We have really no other option than to default on our debt. On, I think, the 12th of April, the government, with some changes with policymakers in the central bank and the Treasury, we did announce a new policy that would see this, an intention to default, an announcement of it preemptively. And now that grace period is done, that officially comes into effect, of course, after the 18th.
So, Chayu, can you describe what life is like now for ordinary Sri Lankans under this economic crisis?
So, of course, different people face it differently. And the richer you are, the more you are able to insulate yourself from the kind of situation that is. But an overall story for an average suburban Sri Lankan commuting to work in the capital, you wake up in the morning, you have to make breakfast for your kids, you have to skip that yourself. You go to work, got to use the bus, 1 hour, 2 hour commute. And there aren't enough buses because there's a fuel shortage because we don't have the money to buy the diesel to run the buses with. That you're squashed into whatever bus that turns up. It's a really terrible time. You go to work, everyone's stressed, from your bosses to the most junior people at work. So it's not a pleasant experience. Your lunch is far smaller, far less nutritious. Doesn't give you enough energy than it used to because of costs again have gone up. Your evening tea, again, no milk, no sugar. You're probably going to take it, just the tea. And then you have to go home again to that whole situation. And we're now in the monsoon season, so it's pouring outside. You're waiting with hundreds of other people waiting for the few buses that roll up, crammed in there, wet, tired, exhausted by the time you get home. And you go home and there's a power cut for another hour or two. And that, you also recognize your next day, you have to leave your parents. Your parents have to go to a fuel queue, a gas queue. Aging parents, you might not have money or the availability of medicines. So it's not really a very pleasant thing for any Sri Lankans. Of course, we've gone through crises as Sri Lankans before, resilient people, so I think we'll bounce back from this. But, very, very, very tough times these days for sure.
All right. Chayu Damasinghe, thank you for helping break that down for us from Colombo.